What's going on, Headliner Nation? Kyle back with the fantasy headliners. And let's talk some tight ends. Okay, I've got my tight end rankings here for week 11. Before we actually talk about the players themselves, let's talk about the position as a whole. Last week, in week 10, only 3 tight ends scored 10 points in half PPR formats. Rob Gronkowski and Cameron Braid are on the same darn team. And then you had Hunter Henry as well, scoring 10 points. The position right now is a wasteland. Honestly, if you don't have Darren Waller or if you don't have Travis Kelce, any single week could end up being a disaster for you. Those are really the only 2 safe bets at the position right now. You could argue flaws, you could argue pros and cons, you could do it all for every other guy past that. So if you own multiple tight ends, that's great. You can kind of try to go back and forth a little bit, but really right now at the position, it's a big old guessing game. We've got a lot of stats, a lot of in-depth information that we look at every single week to try and determine who is going to be the best bet anywhere. But so far this season, it hasn't mattered. You're getting screwed over 90% of the time by your tight end, all right? So let's talk about who I have in my top 20 this week and find out who the safest players could end up being. Number 20, Jordan Aikens. And let me just list these guys right off the bat. Jordan Aikens, Trey Burton, Tyler Higbee, Robert Tonyan, Dalton Schultz, Eric Ibron. Okay, those guys for me are all sits. My starts do not hit until Mike Gaseki at number 14. Ibron, Schultz, Tonyan, Higbee, Burton, Aikens are all sits for me. Here are some reasons why. Jordan Aikens has to deal with Darren Fells. Both of those guys get an equal amount of targets, equal amount of playing time, equal amount of snaps. Trey Burton is splitting snaps and targets with 2 other tight ends. Tyler Higbee is splitting snaps and targets with Gerald Everett. Robert Tonyan, he was a great start for a couple of weeks. That was when there was no Devontae Adams. And then all of a sudden, MVS comes back to life the last couple of weeks. Now Allen Lazard is back as well. I've had a couple of questions. Hey, Kyle, if Devontae Adams were to miss this week for some reason, which I don't think he will be, but if he does miss this week for some reason, do we go with Robert Tonyan? No, we don't. We're not going to. He's going to be a sit for me regardless. Unless we were to find out for some reason Allen Lazard also wouldn't be playing. If it's just MVS, then yeah, Robert Tonyan is going to be bumped probably up to tight end 14 for me, and he will become a start. Dalton Schultz this week, he was one that I went kind of back and forth on. However, you've got 3 wide receivers that you're kind of competing there with Ezekiel Elliott as well. So you've got a lot of guys that he kind of falls behind right now in the pecking order. And Dak, when he was playing, yeah, he was targeting tight end a little bit more often. That hasn't happened since the injury, though. Eric Ibron, this guy has been up and down all season long. Honestly, like a lot of the other people at the position, if he isn't scoring, he isn't worth a start anyway. Why is that? Well, it's because he's got 3 wide receivers that are getting those big plays right now. So really, Ibron is relying on red zone targets to fulfill his tight end duties. And honestly, they're putting together so many big plays right now, it's just not happening. Okay, so those are my sits this week and why they are sits and why they are probably some of the most inconsistent options that you'll have. Now let's bump up into my starts. Mike Gesicki at number 14. He's the definition of the wide receiver position, right? He is as up and down as anybody. I mean, you get a really good matchup for Mike Gesicki, and you're like, oh, hey, this is the week to actually start him. And then, boom, Mike Gesicki tosses up a 0 or a 1 or a 2 right in your face. I mean, this year it's been up and down. Started the year with 30 yards, then went 130. Boom. Okay, we're good. But then he has 2 performances of 15 yards back-to-back. Back to 91 yards against San Francisco. Okay, excellent. Now maybe Mike Gesicki's on a roll. And then he goes 0 yards and 8 yards before putting up the last 2 weeks, 42 and 40 yards. So again, up and down. You just don't know what you're going to get from him every week. And the one thing that concerns me about Gaseki is he's not getting as nearly as many targets as some of these other guys will that are above him. That's why even though he's got some big boom potential, he's not very high in my rankings because he's just not getting the targets. Since that 11 target performance against Buffalo in week 2, he's gone 3-3-6, 2-2, 4-5. Now, 4 and 5 targets against Arizona and the Los Angeles Chargers. Those are encouraging to see because that means he might be growing with Tua a little bit. And as Tua grows, maybe he looks to Gaseki a little bit more often, is kind of being that big playmaker for him. And that's why I'm still trying to be encouraged about Gaseki the rest of the season. And number 13, Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas this week gets a matchup against Cincinnati that allows the second most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. For Logan Thomas this week, it really does, for the most part, rely on touchdowns for him as well. But he is also a guy that is getting a pretty decent amount of targets. He has not had less than 4 targets in any game this season. And from weeks 4 through week 7, he had 4 targets in every game. For the 5 games that sandwich on either side of him, he had 8, 9, and 7 before that, and 6 and 5 over the last 2 weeks. So going back to this scenario now with Logan Thomas, he might be that number 3 target behind Terry McLaurin and then behind the running backs with Alex Smith now. So that can be encouraging for him over the next few weeks and to end the season. At number 12, Jonnu Smith. You know, Jonnu Smith was my big call this offseason as the breakout tight end. And honestly, he looked like that to begin the year, correct? I mean, he had 5 touchdowns in his first 4 games this season? Yeah, 5 touchdowns in his first 4 games. And we were all good. Through week 5, he was the number 1 tight end in terms of points per game. Now, they did not play in week 4, so he had a little bit of some other guys had some advantage on him, but he was still number 1 in fantasy points per game. Since then, though, it's kind of all of a sudden been a drop-off for some reason. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why they've all of a sudden moved away from trying to utilize Jonnu Smith like they were at the beginning of the season. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we really started to sour on Jonnu Smith, and he's kind of tried to come back a little bit since then. 32 yards and a touchdown in week 9, only 14 yards in week 10. He did get that rushing touchdown that kind of saved the week, and now he gets a tough game against Baltimore as well. My hope is that Tennessee gets back to using him. At the beginning of the season, when they rattled off, 5 straight wins? Yeah, 5 straight wins to begin the season. That's when Jonnu Smith was at his best. Is there a correlation between the two? Not necessarily saying that there is, but when you look at the record and you look at what your best players were doing that time, why don't you stick with that formula? Yeah, Corey Davis is back, A.J. Brown is back, but Jonnu Smith is a guy that should thrive in this offense with as much as they're still throwing the football. Even though they're handing the ball off to Derrick Henry a ton right now, they're still throwing the football quite a bit. And because of that, they should be utilizing a playmaker like Jonnu Smith that they can use when you've got Corey Davis and you've got A.J. Brown on the outside. You can utilize Jonnu Smith in the middle of the field, especially when you've got a running back like Derrick Henry that is going to pull linebackers up to the line of scrimmage. I don't know what Tennessee is doing. They got to get their act together, though. I think there's a reason why they were winning when they were utilizing Jonnu Smith. And number 11, Jared Cook. Jared Cook's got an excellent matchup this week against the Atlanta Falcons, who allow the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. With Jared Cook, kind of the same thing as a lot of these other running backs. Tight ends. He's kind of being hampered by the people around him and whether or not they're getting more targets on any given week. To begin the season, when they were dealing with a lot of injuries, Jared Cook was a guy that had 4 touchdowns in his first 6 games. We could really rely on him to be a consistent option for us. Heck, last week against San Francisco, 2 targets. That's all he got. Now, he did play 21 snaps, which was tied for his lowest snap count of the season, but we got to get him back up around that 40 mark that we were seeing at one point in time. The games in which he plays more snaps, believe it or not, he gets more targets. 44 snaps in week 1 led to 7 targets. 41 snaps only led to 3 targets, but 52 yards and a touchdown. 40 snaps led to 7 targets. 21 snaps leads to 2 targets. So again, believe it or not, more snaps, more targets. They got to get him on the field a little bit more often. If Tre'Quan Smith ends up being out with a concussion this week, which he's still questionable at this point, he could still clear as of this recording, okay? There's no guarantee that he's going to be out this week. But if Tre'Quan Smith is out this week, you've got MT back. You've got Alvin Kamara in the backfield still. You've got Emmanuel Sanders there as well. The one thing I'm hoping on from Jared Cook this week is his work in the red zone. Because when Jameis Winston was with Tampa Bay, we know that him and Cameron Brate, and even O.J. Howard at times when he was healthy, had a great connection in the red zone. It was Mike Evans and then kind of Cameron Brate and or OJ Howard when they were in the red zone. He really looked that way quite often. Will the same thing happen with Jared Cook? I'm kind of hoping with his first game this season, his first full game this season, he maybe moves to something that's a little bit more of a reliance for him in the past, something he's familiar with, something that he's comfortable with. That might be Jared Cook in the red zone this week. Moving on to the top 10 now. At number 10, Rob Gronkowski. We've got to be careful with Rob Gronkowski, all right? Big week last week. Absolutely excellent week. For those of you that played Gronk last week, he produced for you exactly how we would like him to produce. However, again, he has got a lot of people that he has to compete with. Just like a lot of these tight ends, his week last week was made on one touchdown, okay? He had a touchdown. Other than that, 3 targets and 2 receptions. His 3 targets was the lowest amount of targets since week 4. In week 4, he had 3 targets. And then after that, he had 6, 8, 8, 4, and 6. Some of you might be catching on to a little bit of a pattern right now, okay? At the tight end position, the one thing that we can do, not to guarantee success, but to give us the best percentage of success, is following the targets. The more targets our tight ends can have, the better. And since right now, there's only really 2 tight ends that have separated themselves from everyone else in terms of being, hey, we are plugging and playing these guys every single week. For me, it really comes down to where is the largest opportunity at? So who's getting the most targets and who has the least amount of weapons around them to take away potential volume? Those are the 2 things that I'm following right now, while also adding in good matchups. Okay, the better the matchup, obviously we want to roll with those. And then least amount of volumes around them. And then on top of that, we want a guy that's getting a lot of targets. And that's kind of the formula that we just have to follow because, yeah, it's not scientific in any nature. But you know what a lot of people say is KISS, right? Keep it simple, stupid. That's what we got to do with the tight end position sometimes. We can't overthink it. And unfortunately, I feel like that's what I've been doing the last couple of weeks. So, you know what? My stupid self is going to try and keep it simple this week. We're following, number 1, good matchups. Number 2, we're following guys that get a decent amount of volume. And number 3, we're following guys that have the least amount of targets around them to take away. At number 9, Dallas Goddard. With Dallas Goddard and Dallas Goddard here, we're going with Dallas Goddard because, number 1, we know Carson Wentz has liked to rely on those tight ends in the past, especially Zach Ertz. Okay, he's back feeling hopefully a little bit better now. And yeah, you've got Jalen Reagor there. You've got Alshon Jeffrey. You've got Travis Fulgham. But you really don't have anybody that's a locked-in-stone stud, right? Now, listen, Jalen Reagor is a stud, and he's going to be very, very soon, okay? But he's not really like that established type of connection right now, correct? He's missed a lot of time this season. Him and Wentz haven't had a lot of time to work together. So there's not something there to really pull away from Dallas Goddard. He's still a top 10 option for me right now because of that. And number 8, Hayden Hurst. Now, Hayden Hurst kind of relies on Calvin Ridley a little bit. I did see right before I recorded this video that it looked like Calvin Ridley got back to practice. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's a full go. Okay, I haven't seen anything to say that he's been removed from any injury reports as of yet. That foot could still potentially be bothering him even though he got back. Some of that is going to be dependent on Hayden Hurst this week. I'm partial to roll with Hayden Hurst still, though, at this point, because it is New Orleans, so it's a pretty good matchup for him. And on top of that, if for some reason that Calvin Ridley is slowed up a little bit by that foot still and not at 100%, then that could be a cue for Hayden Hurst to be that number 2 target. They're not really using anybody out of the backfield in the passing game. Yeah, you've got Julio Jones. The other wide receivers outside of Calvin Ridley, they're hit or miss at times. Or Hayden Hurst is a guy that could definitely be a safety blanket for Matt Ryan. At number 7, Austin Hooper. Austin Hooper, my Manscaped must start of the week. Why? Because number 1, he's got that great matchup. He's got Philadelphia, 4th most fantasy points allowed per game to opposing tight ends. So that would be number 1 in my formula right now, correct? Number 2, what about the weapons around him? Yeah, you've got Kareem Hunt, and yeah, they like to run the ball quite a bit, but OBJ is now gone, their most dynamic playmaker on that team outside of Chubb and Hunt. So now at that point, the wide receivers that are left, none of them have really been doing anything spectacular. None of them really have big ceilings. Baker Mayfield does have a pretty good connection with Jarvis Landry, but Jarvis Landry doesn't have that big of a ceiling either. It's not like Austin Hooper can't step back in and do well down the stretch. Keep in mind, before he had his injury, before he had that emergency surgery, he had 7 targets in week 4, 10 targets in week 5, 6 targets in week 6, 5 receptions in all 3 of those games. He was finally starting to work his way back into fantasy relevance at that point before having that emergency appendectomy. And then in week 10, he comes back and he only gets 2 targets. And what was a really solid matchup for him. However, the wind was absolutely awful. That weather was bad in Cleveland this past weekend. So now we go to Philadelphia. Hopefully the weather's a lot better. This is a guy that, again, before the injury was building up those targets, was becoming a part of that passing game. Hopefully now we can get back into some of those targets. So again, that formula that we're following, okay? Do they have a good matchup? What kind of weapons do they have around him? And then on top of that, how much volume are they getting? Austin Hooper, boom, 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 meeting all 3 of those criteria that I'm trying to follow right now. And number 6, Noah Fant. Noah Fant does have some weapons around him, okay? Obviously, he's got Jerry Jeudy and he's got Tim Patrick. That's a big thing, obviously, okay? They are going to take away volume from Noah Fant, and I acknowledge that in the start and sit video. However, again, we got to look back at what he's done so far this season, okay? He's had 1 game where he has had less than 5 targets, and that was against Atlanta in week 9. A position that he should have absolutely dominated in. But when you look at the amount he plays, he's on the field a lot. 73%, 79, 84, 70, 78, 78, 85. This is a guy that at least 70% of the time he is going to be on the field. That's going to help for those targets. That's going to help for that potential volume. He gets Miami this week. It's a little bit of a tougher matchup, but it's not the worst matchup that you could face. My concern about Noah Fant this week is potentially that the wide receivers have such good games that he kind of gets overlooked a little bit. But last week, though, against the Raiders, 7 targets, only caught 3 of those. If we can get 7 targets again, but we can get back to him catching 5 or 6 passes, that puts us in a lot better position for Noah Fant. Hunter Henry. I said it last week, right? I listed him as a sit. I left him way down in the rankings, and I told all of you, if this guy catches a touchdown, he's going to be a start. And look what happened. The dude caught only a 2nd touchdown of the season and his first one since week 5. Hunter Henry, I love you, man. You're my boy. But did you make me feel salty last week? Yes, you did. But I've said with Hunter Henry all season long. And here we go. Back to the formula. With Hunter Henry, does he have the matchup? Yes, Hunter Henry has the New York Jets. You don't get too much of a better matchup than that. Does he have the volume? Yeah, he does have the volume. He only has 2 games this year with less than 6 targets. His games this year by target, 8-8-7, 4-8, 7-4, 7-6. So he's been getting a good amount of targets every single game. Some of that big playability that we used to see with Hunter Henry, that is what's been lacking a little bit this week, okay, or this season. If he can get back to scoring touchdowns on a more regular basis, then he is a guy that is definitely going to be a top 5 option every single week. A lot of you hate on Hunter Henry, but he hasn't produced any worse than any of the other tight ends this season. The only thing is he hasn't been able to score yet. He's only got 2 touchdowns this year. That's where the big problem comes into play. When you have that little of touchdowns at this position, yes, it is going to unfortunately really hurt your upside every single week. Again, that's pretty simple, right? But when you're looking at, again, what players have done so far this season and what they have been doing, he's not the worst option that you could have on a weekly basis because you know when you throw him out there, he's going to get a decent amount of targets. He's the tight end 11 right now, and he's only played in 9 games too. Okay, a couple of the guys in front of him, like a Jimmy Graham and a Rob Gronkowski, by the time they have their bye weeks, he could be a guy that jumps over them. And now you're looking at Hunter Henry as more like a tight end 7. So again, people have been hating on Hunter Henry this season, but there's not really any reason to. He's actually one of the more dependable tight ends in terms of volume. He just hasn't turned him into the big plays yet. At number 4, TJ Hawkinson. This week gets a matchup with Carolina. Carolina pretty good against opposing tight ends. The reason I have TJ Hawkinson so high right now, though, is because I'm still not fully believing that Kenny Golladay plays this week. And if he does, I'm not fully believing that he's 100% healthy. So I'm still going to roll with TJ Hawkinson. But Headliner Nation, you and I, we've had this argument back and forth this year, right? I'm a Lions fan. I've got nothing against TJ Hawkinson. He was my tight end one this season, or the season that he came out of the draft. Not this season, excuse me. He was the tight end one in the draft when he came out. I love TJ Hawkinson. Detroit is a bunch of idiots. They don't know how to game plan. They don't know how to use their best weapons. Their coaches should be fired. Their owner should sell the team. They really should probably just close up shop and relocate or something because they suck. I'm about ready to rant on the Lions and how much I hate them, but this is a tight end video. There's no place for that. That's why TJ Hawkinson is so inconsistent for me, though, when I look at him on a daily basis, because yeah, he's had some good games this year, but the volume hasn't always been there for him, and he's had to rely on those touchdowns. If you take those touchdowns from TJ Hawkinson, if you take TJ Hawkinson and Hunter Henry and mold them together and give Hunter Henry the touchdowns and TJ Hawkinson the upside with the volume on a weekly basis, we've now made a tight end one, baby, because that's what we would have. We would cradle it, we would hold it, okay, we would feed it, we would nurture it, because it would be one of the best tight ends in the league, and there's not very many of those around right now, okay? That's what we would have with those two. But no Kenny Golladay, lots of volume. Typically, last week had that toe injury pop up late, so he didn't have a really good week. So then you get to the top 3. Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, and Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews first. Mark Andrews, for me, has one of the highest upsides every single week, even though it hasn't been there. Why? Because he is the set-in-stone, locked #1 target of that passing game. I don't care if Willie Snead has a good week. I don't care if Marquise Brown has a good week. They don't really utilize the passing game out of the backfield that often. They don't have a wide receiver that is a #1 true set-in-stone wide receiver. Mark Andrews is the wide receiver 1 of that team as a tight end. Unfortunately, Lamar Jackson has just been uber inconsistent this year, but he gets Tennessee this week, and that defense can be a little soft in the back end sometimes. That probably sounded really weird in a tight end video, but whatever. And then Darren Waller at number 2 and Travis Kelce at number 1. Travis Kelce, if you own him, you play him every week. Darren Waller, if you own him, you play him every week. Both of them have good matchups this week. Both of them are playing against each other. I expect both of them to lock it in and have really good weeks. There you have it. Headliner Nation. Really got into it, that video. Very passionate about my tight ends, if you haven't noticed by now. Do me a favor, though. Hit that like button down below if you appreciate the content. Leave me comments down below. If you got questions about anyone, hit me up in the comments. I'll get you as many as possible. And as always, if you're new here to the Fantasy Headliners, hit that subscribe button, become a part of Headliner Nation today. Appreciate you, everybody. Thanks for tuning into this episode. I'll catch you on the live show Saturday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on the Fantasy Headliners. I'll catch you then. Have a good one. Stay safe. Stay healthy. I'll see you later.